Hello, welcome to the My Best Fail podcast. I'm your host, Diana Lanham, and my guest today is Lisa Sugarman. Lisa is an author, a nationally syndicated columnist, a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project, and a storyteller with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Lisa is also a survivor of suicide loss, and she's going to be sharing her story today of how a traumatic life event took her on a journey from pain to purpose. Please welcome my guest, Lisa Sugarman. Lisa, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here today. And even though it's going to be a heavy subject, I'm very excited to have you share your story with my audience.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that, Diana. And I appreciate just you kind of opening up your platform and your orbit, people who are in your orbit to me, so that my story can hopefully have an impact on them and hopefully give them some things to think about that maybe they haven't thought about before.
You are an author, a syndicated columnist, and a mental health advocate. Did you become a writer as a consequence of your story? Or have you always been writing in the mental health arena?
So I have been a writer forever. I've been a writer since I was old enough to hold a pencil. It's all I ever wanted to be. It's all I ever wanted to do. And it's something that I started probably, God, when I was maybe 6 years old, 5 or 6 years old, writing little pretend newspapers in my neighborhood for all the neighbors. So I've been at this for a really long time, and I've done a lot of different types of writing. I was a newspaper reporter. I've been a magazine writer. Um, God, I've worked for healthcare publishing companies, done marketing and PR. Obviously, I've written a bunch of books. I've been a columnist. So I've done a lot of different types of writing. So my experience in that space is pretty diverse, which has been kind of nice because I draw on different experiences of writing over the years in different ways at different times. So I this definitely did not flesh that out for me. It was something that I already was. It just changed the trajectory of the writing that I was doing. I went from writing about marriage and family and parenting. I was in the parenting space for a really long time, have a bunch of parenting books out there, wrote a column for probably a dozen or so years, a syndicated column that while it was about everything that we all go through in life, marriage, life, work, family, that sort of thing, there was definitely a heavy emphasis on family and raising kids because that's what I was doing at the time. So I did that for a really long time, and it was actually my father's suicide that I should say the revelation of my father's suicide, which is a big part of my story, that really kind of changed gears for me. It was just a complete gear shift into the mental health space. And I haven't looked back. I've been exclusively creating content and speaking and writing in that space ever since.
So, can you talk to me about just who you were and your family and the situation and kind of start your story there and move us forward?
So I'm an only child, and my parents had this absolutely beautiful marriage. They married in 6 months from meeting each other. They were madly in love. They had this just beautiful, warm, loving way about them, and they adored each other. And I was, I guess, the byproduct of that, which is a beautiful way to feel. And I had a beautiful little childhood. My dad was my best friend in the world. He was an outdoorsman. He raced cars as a hobby. His parents had a lot of real estate north of Boston where we live. And so my father had a full time job, but he also managed that for them. And I was like his little buddy. I would go with him on the weekends and, kind of be his little pal. And I remember waking up every morning to the sounds of my mom and dad just laughing in the kitchen, having coffee before I got up. And that was my childhood. So it was a very positive one. And when I was 10 years old, everything changed. Everything changed literally overnight. My father kissed me goodnight and I never saw him again. And he died of what I was told at the time was a heart attack, a massive heart attack. And while he was in excellent shape because he was a mountain climber and he was a tennis player and he was a very active man, he was a very heavy smoker. And back in the 1970s, that was just what people did. And we didn't understand the consequences the way we do now. So it wasn't like for my 10-year-old brain, it wasn't like a really big stretch to the imagination to believe that somehow, okay, my dad was a big smoker, so that's not great for you. Okay, he had a heart attack. I guess that makes sense. So it was nothing I ever questioned. And my father was just a charismatic and charming and just funny, upbeat, motivated man who everybody loved, and he loved everyone. And so there were no signs or signals that anything was wrong under the surface. And plus, I was a 10-year-old kid. Like, what was I paying attention to at that point? It wasn't like I knew anyway, but my mother didn't see anything. No one saw anything. So when my father died and my mother told me that it was a heart attack, I didn't question it for 35 years until so my father passed away when he was 45. Ironically, when I was 45, I had a very, very unexpected conversation with a family member, just a cousin. I bumped into her while my husband and I were just eating at a cafe in my hometown. We were chatting, and in the course of that conversation, just catching up, just how are your kids? How are my kids? She asked me if my daughters had any of the same mental illness that my father had, and I didn't know what the hell she was talking about. Completely random and unexpected question. And my husband's kind of making eye contact with me over the table, like, what the hell kind of a question was that? What did that even refer to? Kind of gave her a quick answer and said, no, my girls were they were fine. And I just filed it away. Shortly after that conversation with my cousin, I did have lunch with my mom, and it wasn't like I made a beeline to her to talk to her specifically about this weird comment my cousin made, but it did come up. And I did ask her if my dad was depressed. And that's how I started the conversation. And she said yes. And before I even knew what I was asking or that I was going to ask the question, because I had never even considered it, even after my cousin made that kind of strange comment, it never made me start thinking, oh, well, did dad have mental illness? Did dad die by suicide? It didn't make me think any of those things, not consciously. So now I'm sitting in front of my mother, and out of absolutely nowhere, I asked her if he had taken his life, and she said yes. And it just rewrote everything.
So you automatically went to suicide? And do you know why you did that?
No, I have no idea. To this day, I have done, Diana, I have done so much reflecting, both privately, personally, in therapy. I mean, I've done so much reflecting in the last, it's been 10 years now since that moment, since that day when everything kind of changed for me. I have no idea. The conversation didn't even start off with me having the intention of talking to her about that encounter with my cousin. It was really just a we were just kind of having lunch and catching up, and then the conversation just kind of moved to my dad, and it moved to kind of the stress that he had been under when he passed away, and which I knew about. And it had to do with what I mentioned earlier about him having his own busy full-time job and then having to manage his family's business. So that was very challenging. And his family was a very difficult, very, very difficult, dark, um, money bottom line oriented family is the only way that I can put it. And I'm being blunt because I need to say it bluntly. That's just what it was. My dad's nickname was the unwanted. Yeah, that was my grandmother's nickname.
Because of his birth or because of the trajectory of his business or what he was did she not like your mother?
My father was born the night of an eclipse, and my grandmother was not happy that the birth of my father disrupted her being able to go and see this eclipse because it was a once in a 75-year or 100-year event. And her not being able to do the thing she wanted to do, he became her unwanted. And whether or not that was a joke that went too far, or uh, whether there was, real annoyance attached to that, I really don't know. And I never had a conversation about it with my grandmother, but I know that my father used to hear that throughout his entire life.
It's an awful thing to say.
My mother at that time, when I was 10, and so completely unprepared to deal with my father being gone forever, in that moment, she felt like it was just too much for me to have to handle as a 10-year-old child, to have to handle the knowledge that he had chosen to leave. Whether he was mentally ill or whether it was beyond his control, whatever the circumstances were, when someone dies by suicide, they're taking their own life. And I would have known that.
Was that the general story, or was it just for to protect you?
I grew up in a very small town north of Boston, a little harbor town north of Boston. My aunt, my mother's older sister, lived about 10 streets away in one direction. My father's sister lived about 2 miles away in another direction. We all lived in very close proximity to each other. So when my mother found my father, I was away at day camp for the day.
Thank God.
Yeah, well, she was with someone. She was with a friend from work. My mother worked literally around the corner at a nursing home, and my father was supposed to meet her, and he never came, and she couldn't reach him over the phone. So a friend who was a volunteer firefighter who worked at her nursing home saw that she was getting very, very concerned, and he said, "You know what? Let me just I'll pop you home. Let me go home with you just to make sure everything's okay." And they found him. So it was, and that was middle of the day. It was supposed to be lunchtime. So that was the middle of the day. I was coming home in a matter of hours, 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So my mother had to call everyone, they had to attend to my father. All the things had to be done in a very short period of time. So immediately the calls went out. My mom's siblings who were in the area came. So my two aunts were there. My grandmother was there. Not my father's mother. My mother's mother was there, and it was in they had come and they had taken my father. So my mother was just kind of trying to get everything organized before I came home. And my two aunts were making the bed where my father had passed away. So you have to understand that the dynamic of the way things happened. My father had obviously very carefully planned how this was going to happen, and we lived in a home with a big family room down in the basement. And there was a baseball game on the night that my father passed away, and my father told my mother, the game might run into extra innings. I'm going to sleep down here tonight because we had a little pull-out sofa. I'm going to sleep down here tonight because if it runs into extra innings, I don't want to come up and wake you up when I come back into bed. So I'll stay down and watch the game. I'll just sleep down here. Well, that was obviously very orchestrated. And so my father had left a note, and it was in the bed with him. And my aunts found the note. So they didn't read the note, they gave it directly to my mom. And so my mother knew the note, my two aunts knew, and my grandmother knew. Um, it was never discussed again. My mother acknowledged that there was a note to my grandmother and said, "What do I do?" And my grandmother said, "You have to do whatever you believe in your heart you need to do." There was never another thing spoken ever again.
Your poor mom.
Yeah.
I mean, losing a husband, anyways, is tragic and traumatic, but to lose your partner under such circumstances and then to hold the secret, even if you think you're doing it for all the right reasons, is such a heavy burden.
When I did find out the truth after so many decades, my initial reaction was I was absolutely furious at my father. I was never upset with my father for leaving me. I was bullshit at my father for leaving my mother in that circumstance, for leaving my mother to have to raise me alone, to have to navigate motherhood and fatherhood and be all the things to me that I would need in the course of my life, and to manage the day-to-day life chores and responsibilities. I was so angry at my father for that. A lot of people don't know this. Only really probably my husband knows. I haven't probably even shared most of it with my mom because I just didn't want her to be, affected by it. But I couldn't look at a picture of my father for 3 years. I couldn't. I didn't want to mention his name. I was someone who, as the mother of two daughters who had never met their grandfather, and someone whose father was so important to me, it was always something that was top of mind for me to always have my father be part of the conversation. And, oh, Papa Jimmy would do this or Papa Jimmy would do that. Or I wanted my kids to feel him. I wanted my kids to feel like they knew him and to feel his presence all the time. And I just shut it all down. I couldn't do it. I couldn't look at him the same. I couldn't think about him in the same way. It took a long, long time for me to find my way back to him. And it was only after, and I think a part of that, a big part of that for me was the fact that my own internal belief system about suicide, and this came from nowhere else, it came from inside me. I always felt like it was a selfish act, which a lot of people do. It's just a very common reaction to suicide. And because I had lost a cousin to suicide a year before my father passed away, and I did know that it was a suicide. So that was when I was 9 years old, that was my first experience with suicide. In as much as my parents would, told me about it in an age appropriate way. But it was just the way that I perceived it. And I think it was once I finally made that switch in my own brain and kind of rewired my own belief system to understand that it's not an issue of it being a selfish act. It's an illness. I mean, and it was such a simple understanding, but it took me time to get there, that mental illness is just an illness like any other illness that needs to be acknowledged and treated and validated and um, cared for in the way that you would if someone had cancer, the way you would if someone had heart disease. Any of those illnesses are no different. And so for me, once I made that mental shift, felt connected again to my dad. I felt close to him, and in a way that I hadn't for a long time.
So I want to go back to the conversation that you had with your mother. What was her reaction when you came out and directly said, "Did your father commit suicide?"
There was kind of that second where someone's processing something that they clearly were not expecting. So there was that 1 or 2 second moment where, which of course in my own head and heart felt eternal because I'm waiting for the answer. I think she just maybe knew it was time. She didn't want to lie to me. She had resigned herself. Of course, we've talked a million times since then about all of this. And in her mind, she was never going to tell me because, first of all, just a little bit of more context is that she didn't tell me when I was 10 for the reasons I shared, that she was afraid that it would just take me down. And I think she was absolutely right. It absolutely may have, because I don't think I could have handled knowing that not only was he gone, but he had taken his own life. So,
Especially at 10 years old.
yeah, like, what am I going to do with that? Not to mention 10 years old in 1978. Who in the hell was talking about suicide, and who had programs for teens or children or spouses? And I mean, that was so underground, if it existed at all. So, my mother was just worried about me and, kind of preserving whatever bits of normalcy she could for me. So then she thought about telling me when I was in high school. And then she's like, but you're in high school, and you're starting this brand new phase in your life. And then all of a sudden I'm going to lay this on you. And she thought the same thing when I went to college and when I got married. And so there was like always something, there was always a reason not to. And then she finally got to a point where she thought, you know what is the real reason for me to even disclose this? Like, he's gone. It's certainly not going to bring him back, and knowing it's going to cause her pain. So she kept it to herself. But she did promise herself that if I ever asked, she would never lie to me. But there would have been no reason for me to ever ask, because there would be no reason for me to question until I did. And when I did, I think she, in that split second, she knew it was the moment. And she had to kind of go back to that promise she had made to herself to not lie to me. And she just immediately acknowledged it as being true. I just felt so upset about the pain that I knew that she felt, having to make me feel now all of this brand new pain and have to relive all of it. Because in that moment, it just completely rewound my clock. I was all of a sudden right back to the very same minute that I lost my father for the first time. I was doing it all over again for the second time in my life. Now I'm a 45-year-old mother of two. I've been married at that time. I've been married, 20 years. And here I am all of a sudden grieving my father's death again, after I've already grieved my father's death for the last 35 years. So for her, she just felt such incredible sadness that she had to lay that on me, and that I was now going to have to find my way through it. Those nights of just crying myself to sleep or crying with my mom. And I mean, we've always been so close ever since I was little. So, I mean, we always have shared everything together. And so, of course, we grieved together. But, there are times when you're just by yourself. You're by yourself in bed or you're by yourself during the day. And those thoughts are with you, whether you're ready for them or not. And um, this was no different. This was just like right back at square one all over again. But it was like such a different experience because now all of a sudden it's a suicide. I think that's been the hardest thing for me to reconcile with. And I don't know if I'll ever reconcile with it. While we do understand, like I spoke earlier about, my father's family and how challenging his upbringing was and his parents were and how much stress that caused, there is no doubt in my mind or my mother's mind that all of that was a huge contributor to why my father ended his life.
Did he give her a specific reason in his note?
It was very general, more of just an I can't go on and I love you and I'm sorry.
At least she had a note. I think to not have any words,
Mm.
I think that would be unbearable as well, right?
We've had thousands and thousands of conversations in the past 10 years about this, all aspects of it. Anything, any angle you could possibly imagine, my mother and I have talked it through, and we continue to do that. And it's been beautiful for both of us. And that's something to me, that's a gift that I can now support her. She shielded me from all of this pain, and now I can be there to help her reprocess the things that maybe she didn't have the ability to process as someone who was keeping it all to herself and wasn't seeing a therapist. Wasn't I mean, my mother's incredibly supportive of therapy. She just never felt that it was something that she needed for herself.
That's amazing. That is a huge weight to bear.
Yeah,
When you're hiding a secret for love, for all the right reasons,
yeah.
but you're hiding it and you're grieving and you have questions.
My mother's a remarkable woman. She's a remarkable woman.
It had to be like a freeing.
It is now, but in the beginning, my mother, like I'll never forget that first day. So as I mentioned, when it came out, we were kind of sitting in my car in a parking lot a mile from my house, and I think we must have sat there for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and we're sobbing and crying, and I had so many questions, and in that moment, she was so upset that she had said something. She wasn't upset that she told me the truth. She was just upset that what came out was something that was going to change me forever. So then we get to my house and my kids, I believe, were at school and my husband works out of the house. Both of us work out of the house. So he was home. And then I called my husband out to the car and I said, I need you to come out to the car right now. And he came out to the car and he knew the second he laid eyes on me, he knew something was wrong. And I said, I need you to drive. We need to go for a drive. I need to talk to you. When I told my husband while we were driving what had happened, he didn't want to believe it. He was hoping that maybe somehow it may not have been the case. And as soon as I said he had left a note, it became real for him too. And he understood that this was what we were dealing with. And to his credit, I have to say, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him, for both of them.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Cried myself to sleep, I think, for 3 years straight. Every night, I led two very, very separate lives. Anyone who knows me, any friends of mine who might be listening to any of the interviews that I've given over the last couple of years where I've shared this part of it, I was two very distinctly different people. And you would never have known that those two people were the same person because in my outward facing life, I was working, I was in the school system, I was writing, I was a mom, I was a coach, I was a friend, I was a daughter, I was doing all the things. I was going through all the motions. And when I would get behind closed doors, I was I was a shell. I couldn't process things. I was just overcome with emotion and grief and shock. I didn't at that point decide yet that I was ready to talk to someone. I mean, I had been in therapy just when I was in my early 20s and had like taken a gap year from college and didn't know what I wanted to do and like sought out therapy for that. So I took a humongous break from therapy from the time I was in my 20s until the time I was in my 50s. And I was just really dealing with all of it kind of behind closed doors with Dave because my girls didn't know yet. I wasn't ready to talk to them about it yet. I don't know what I thought I needed to be ready. There, I don't even remember at this point what the catalyst was for me being ready to share that. I think it actually, that's a lie. I think I do know what it was. I think I kind of reconciled with the fact that it was not a selfish act. And once I realized, understood the connection between mental illness and suicide, and that it's beyond someone's control, and that you do get hijacked and manipulated by mental illness, that's when I found my way back to my dad, and that's when I felt like, okay, now I see it from a different perspective. Now my kids are, they're teenagers and going into high school and going to college, and they deserve to understand the truth about their DNA and about their family history, and in the same way that alcoholism can run in a family,
Yeah.
illness can run in a family. And I felt very strongly that my daughters both needed to know kind of the truth of my father's suicide, so that if someday in their lives they all of a sudden started seeing, changes in themselves, or depression in themselves or anxiety in themselves, that they would understand, like, okay, there's some history there, and there's some DNA that supports that there. And so, okay, let's have a conversation, let's keep the communication lines open, let's talk about it with your sister, talk about it with mom and dad, talk about it with your grandparents. So once I talked about it with my girls, and then I, of course, then it was like a ripple effect. Then it became, you know, kind of the girls, the immediate family, my in-laws, my sister-in-law, my, brother-in-law, and it just kind of, the circle got wider, and then it became, close friends, and ultimately then I stopped giving people the narrative that my dad had a heart attack. When questions have ever come up about, oh, where do your parents live? Oh, my mom lives in Florida. I lost my dad when I was 10. And then inevitably someone says, how did your father die? And for the longest time, after I found out the truth of his suicide, I was still reverting back to that old narrative of a heart attack because I wasn't ready. And it's interesting. I wasn't, when I think a lot about why I kind of stayed in that place, kind of stayed with that narrative, it really was not about a stigma for me as much. I really just felt like it was more of a reconciliation in my own mind. It was like, until I came around to realize that there was nothing selfish about it whatsoever. He was mentally ill, and that's what drove his decision. He didn't want to leave us. He didn't want to leave my mother. He didn't want to leave me or our life. He wanted the pain to end. And that is why people take their life. That is why. And when I got to that place, from that point on, I've been nothing but transparent about it.
I've never had anyone who's had to deal with someone dying twice. Yeah, and it's very sad.
Everybody has a story, right?
Yes, but it's just, it's a very heart heavy story, and it's just, it makes me sad that that's the burden that you had. And I'm very sad for your mother that she had to carry that burden. And I know that she did it with absolute love and protect. It shows how much she loves you and how much she didn't want you to be burdened. But I'm sad that your mom lived through that almost by herself, right?
I am too. I mean, so much came out when the truth came out. So many feelings of just kind of looking back over my entire life, and looking back over everything that felt in that moment like it completely changed and was totally different. And it's interesting, my husband Dave, over the course of those first few years, helped me in so many ways. I mean, just holding space more than anything, holding me physically, being there to kind of hold me together. But one of the most important things, the most powerful things that he said to me during that time was in response to something I said and kept saying in the beginning. Especially, I said, it changed everything, because to me it felt like it changed everything. It it felt like, I don't like to use the word contaminated, but it's the only one that I can sometimes think of in this context. It did feel like it kind of contaminated everything for me that I believed was so beautiful and so wholesome and so real about my upbringing and my relationship with my dad and my mom and dad's marriage and all those things. And that was just the feeling that I got that I could not shake. And one day Dave said, I know why you say it changed everything, but it really didn't change anything. I mean, it changes how you now know he died. It changes those circumstances. Doesn't change how much he loved mom. Doesn't change how much he loved you. Doesn't change any of the memories that you had with him. Like I used to do everything with my father. I mean, I mentioned he was an outdoorsman. I have been an avid mountain climber my entire life because of my father, have loved nature, have loved movement. My father, I said before he raced cars. I've always loved cars. I mean, everything that I shared with him, all of those memories we created, like all that's real. And he reminded me
Yeah.
that none of that changed at all. And that was huge for me because that kind of expelled a lot of those feelings of contamination for me. And it brought me back to a place of, okay, it did affect how he died. It had everything to do with the way in which he died. But that's really it. And obviously, too, there are other byproducts of that. Like, okay, my dad was suffering. My dad had mental illness. My mother had no idea. You asked me a question that I don't think I answered because I think we ended up jumping to something else. But my mother had no idea whatsoever that my father was struggling. The only what she did know was that he had an incredible amount of stress from the business that he ran for my grandparents. He knew that there was an incredible she knew there was an incredible amount of stress
Mm.
caused by my father's family. She also knew that at the very end of his life, probably within the last few weeks of his life, he did tell her that he had decided to go to a therapist to try and talk about some of the things that were troubling him because he had wanted to make a career change. He worked for a company in Boston and he was, as I had said before, very into real estate with his family, found that he loved it, wanted to start his own real estate business. And so really was just trying to kind of talk to someone to help reconcile some of what he was dealing with, but we just think it was too little too late.
When you just said, mentioned that you felt that it had contaminated your memories, if your father wasn't showing any outward signs, the happiness that you felt about being around your dad, you would have to think that those were reciprocated and mirrored feelings, right? He wouldn't bring you around. It'd be one thing if your mom was like, you need to babysit her. You need to babysit Lisa today.
Right.
So she's going to go with you. I get stuff done. It sounds like he was sharing his life with you.
We were buddies. I was a tomboy. He had a daughter who loved to, throw the baseball in the front lawn, who loved to go mountain climbing, who loved to go, we live in a harbor town, loved to go dock diving. I mean, all the things. And we shared so many passions together. And he exposed me to so many things that he loved that now are just, kind of interwoven with the things that I love. And our relationship was such a gift. I mean, it was short lived, but it was a gift, and I knew it was real. I just it's hard. It's hard when the circumstances change so radically from what you believe your entire life. It's really hard to not have that kind of permeate everything. And it was a lot of work for me. And like I said, I think Dave and what he said and how he kind of reframed it for me is really what kind of got me back to a place of recognizing, yeah, moving forward and recognizing that I hadn't lost as much in all of this as I felt that I lost when I initially found out about his suicide.
So let's talk about how it is it's kind of informed your work and how you move forward. Because I know that you are a crisis counselor, right? Do you work with the Trevor Project?
I do.
You work with organizations and support organizations and write about, mental health and mental health awareness. So, how did that experience shape who you are now and how you move forward?
I would never have, I think, been in this space that I'm in doing the work that I'm in. I mean, aside from the fact that I've always been a content creator, I've always been a writer, that has never changed. That existed long before I ever found anything out about my father. But the space that I write in and the work that I create now, the fact that it completely and totally focuses on mental health and wellness and suicide awareness and prevention, like that is completely new as of the last several years. And I can almost assure you that I would never have found my way to this place were it not for the revelation of my father's suicide. And also, and I mean, unfortunately, it's not just my father's suicide. My cousin I mentioned earlier passed away by suicide a year before my father in 1977. He lived right up the street around the corner from me. He was 18 years old. And 3 years ago, last Friday, one of our closest friends from childhood, from the time we were about 5 years old, he took his life 3 years ago last week. Um, and that was a complete and total shock to all of us. We had absolutely no idea he was struggling, absolutely no idea it was coming. And so all of these losses and suicides have taken me in a completely different direction. But it's honestly, Diana, it's like the have you I don't know if you've ever been in a point in your life where you felt like the place you were in or the work you were doing or the focus that you had was exactly where you were meant to be
Hmm.
in that moment, in that time and space. And obviously I wish all three of them were still here. I I wish that every day. But I'm grateful that I know the truth about my father. More than anything at all, I'm grateful that I know the truth about my father for the sake of being able to support my mom now and to be there to talk to her and to be able to hold space for her and to be able to walk through it all with her and have it be an open and fluid and constant conversation because we're always grieving.
Especially moving forward, like we had talked about, grief never goes away. You just basically learn how to you learn how to manage it, and you learn how to walk through your days.
There is no endpoint to grief. I don't care how the person died. I don't care who the person was. There is no end point to grief. But so I'm grateful now that I can be there to support my mom as a way of, you know, thanking her for all the support she's given me. You know, we have moments. Look, grief attacks are real things,
Yeah.
and you know, you think you're in a place of clarity and peacefulness and groundedness, and then all of a sudden you see something or hear something or you go somewhere and it, you know, everything just kind of comes back and hits you in the face like a brick. And that, you know, and that happens all the time. But what I've learned is when it happens, I let it happen, and it takes me wherever it's going to take me, and I talk about it when I need to talk about it, and you find your way to the other side of it. Once I started being open and transparent about it and letting myself be vulnerable about it, the impact that I saw it having on other people who I was having conversations with, like I'm never going to walk up to someone and just unsolicited start a conversation about how my father took his life, but it comes up more often than I would ever even have dreamt it would come up. And mental health and wellness nowadays, you know, the world we're living in. So this is prevalent everywhere. 700,000 people die by suicide around the world every year. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Once I started talking about it, seeing the impact it was having on people and seeing how my vulnerability was creating vulnerability in other people, and it was encouraging, not by design, but it just happened that way, that people then started sharing more with me. And then I started writing about it here and there. And the real tipping point for me, there's a podcaster out of Canada who I had made a post. It was probably about 3 or 4 years ago. I had made a post on social media in recognition of, I think, International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day, or it was one of those types of um, recognition days. I made a post, and it was the first time I had ever publicly acknowledged that my father had died by suicide. And this podcaster, somehow we didn't know each other. We had no connections whatsoever. She saw my post and she reached out to me and she asked if I would ever be willing to come on her podcast and share my story. I had never even considered doing something like that before. And I said yes. And the response that I got from sharing my story on that podcast was so overwhelming. And I don't mean in a bad way, I mean so moving and so beautiful and so cathartic for me and apparently for other people that I just kept sharing. And that was really the tipping point for me. I started sharing it whenever I had the opportunity. I started writing it, interjecting it into my writing. And then it was very shortly thereafter that all of a sudden everything that I was writing was focusing on in some way mental health or suicide awareness or just general health and wellness. You just get to a point where you find the space that you know you belong, or at least I did. And then it was like, okay, well, what more can I do? What more can I do? And so you and I know talked offline when we first met, kind of why did I decide on Trevor Project to be a crisis counselor? Well, for those who are listening who don't already know, the Trevor Project is the largest LGBTQ focused, centric um, crisis and support lifeline for at risk LGBTQ youth in this country. And that was such a big draw to me because my oldest daughter is bisexual. I came out as pansexual a few years ago. My father passed away by suicide. I've lost a couple of other family members and friends by suicide. So to me, the Trevor Project was the place where I could have the biggest impact on the communities that I wanted to be able to help. So I reached out to them, became a part of their program, was trained. It's a very extensive um, intense but beautiful training experience, and have been on the lifelines taking calls from, and it's not just people who are suicidal. People have a misconception that these numbers are 988 numbers, or a number like, the Trevor Project is just for people who are in a suicidal state of mind, but it's not. Therefore, if you are in emotional crisis, if you are dealing with abuse or job insecurity or fear of coming out because your family's going to disown you, or you've lost your job, or you ended a relationship, or you've lost someone who has died, I mean, anything that would constitute, a stressor. A crisis is relative. What might be a crisis for me might not be a crisis for you. We validate everybody who calls, whatever your issue or your crisis or your circumstance might be. I wanted to be kind of in the epicenter of those communities, helping. And my father, I wish my father had had someone that he could have talked to, that he could have connected with, who could have
Yeah.
helped him kind of through that dark place, but he didn't. So the thing that I felt I could do to honor him was to be that person on the other end of the phone. And so I've been doing it now. It'll be 2 years this fall. And then from that, I've actually done some collaborations recently with Trevor Project, sharing some of the content that I create outside of being a crisis counselor for them, which has been beautiful. I do a lot with Samaritans here in the Boston area. Also a facilitator for a very specific kind of grief and loss group that's focused on survivors of suicide loss, very specifically. I was trained by Samaritans to be one of their safe place facilitators, facilitating those meetings where people come, and they're free meetings and they're virtual, and you can come and just talk to other survivors. I'm also a storyteller with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I go around um, my home state of Massachusetts, and I share my story with different, civic organizations, school organizations, and and get my story out in the mainstream as a way of encouraging other people to share their own. So yeah, one thing kind of led to another to another. I rebranded the column that I wrote for all those years. Now I write a new column. It's called "We Are Who We Are," and it's here in Boston, but it's everywhere. And it's it's a way of introducing the hard topics. It's a way of having the hard conversations. I'm granted it's a column, so it's me and it's my opinion. It's not necessarily quite the back and forth dialogue, but the point is to bring up the subjects that people haven't been bringing up, that people are either afraid or put off or unprepared for, and to try and talk about them in a way that makes them less scary, normalizes them.
If you were ever going to do things that helped you manage through it, being a storyteller is obviously your superpower. So you just being strong enough to go out and tell your story, I think, is a big deal.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And you know what? It's what I do have to say, and I do want to clarify that at this point in this journey, I guess you can call it a journey, is that it's not a burden anymore. It's not a burden, and in fact, I mean, it may sound either spot on or it may sound very far-fetched. It depends on who you are listening to this comment that I'm gonna make. But at this point in my life, knowing is actually a gift to me. It's it's a gift to me that I have the capacity to share what's happened to me, to share my lived experience, to share the ways that I've navigated my cousin, my father, and my friend by suicide. One is too many, three is ridiculous. But I think of all the things in the world that we as human beings can gift to each other is our lived experience, because something, maybe something you've done, maybe you share your story, maybe you've lost someone and you share your story with me, and you share something you've thought or something you've done or a way that you've coped, and maybe that triggers something for me in a positive way. Maybe that all of a sudden activates a thought that now I can, well, wait a minute, if Diana did that and that was really helpful to Diana, maybe I could try that. Maybe that might be helpful to me. And then all of a sudden, it becomes this domino effect where more of us who are sharing our experiences and our stories are empowering each other to support one another and to try, maybe what works for me works for you, or maybe it doesn't, but it leads to something else. So whatever's happening, it's this domino effect, this pay it forward effect that allows us to give and to take from each other. And that's community.
Mm-hmm.
I love building community. I love supporting community. I love being part of community, because, and this is just an extension of that, sharing our stories. Like, what did people used to do before there was television, before there were books, before there were, um, means by which to globally share things? We sat around fire pits and we talked to each other and we told stories.
That's why I started My Best Val, so that people could tell their stories and other people could see themselves in them. Their spirit is lifted, they decide to take a risk, or they just, they have peace.
That's one of my favorite things in the world, is to be able to connect with people
Me too.
and further build those connections. So that's why I always feel so grateful to have opportunities like this to come on and be exposed to a whole new community of people who aren't part of, of my day to day, who, who I can then, maybe, hopefully, if I'm lucky enough, impact in a positive way.
Hopefully, at one point, we are either attending a conference or we are at an event that kind of brings us together. And I told you that I lived in Boston for a long time and I love it there. So maybe I will see you in Boston, especially Marblehead.
I would love that. I would love that. Yeah. It's always so much fun for me getting a chance to, talk to people all over the world. And then I've had great experiences at times being able to connect in real life with some of those people. And it's just such a fun opportunity to meet face to face.
I'm afraid to say something else because I feel like I'm going to start another conversation and I know you have
Oh, yeah, I know. No, that's okay. Well, you know where to reach me. You can get me anytime.
Well, thank you again, Lisa. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll see you.
I appreciate you.
Bye. Would you like to be a guest on our show? If you have a story to tell, send us an email at contact@mybestfell.tv. If we think it's a good fit, we'll reach out.